Hello, everyone. Okay, I just wanted on the record that Mercury is definitely in retrograde today. Because if tech stuff could have gone wrong, yeah, it did. It did. It went wrong. But that's okay, because we're here now and we're all ready to talk about what we're going to talk about. And yeah, I'm good. I'm good with that. I'm good. I'm good now. So I am so excited to be here. I'm excited that it's Friday. I am looking forward. I will be moving. I will be, going off somewhere over the weekend, and I will be back. I'll be around. Anyways, I'll let that all be a surprise for you. So we're here not to talk about that today. We are here to talk about okay, I've been going in chronological order, right? So the other day, I actually sat down and started to reorganize all of the papers because, as you could probably imagine, my hard drive is filled with papers and articles and discussion pieces, and there's lots of them. And I missed a little bit of a sniver of stuff, and I didn't really miss it. If you remember, I was focusing a lot on let me think about the words. Plant intelligence and plant consciousness, right? So we've been going through and really focusing on the debate and the whole discussion piece around plant consciousness and all these different elements from it, which are all extremely important, right? And I'm very happy we did it that way, because it gave us a really strong foundation. If you're new around here, hi, welcome. Tell me where you're from. Put it into the chat. I'd love to hear it. But also in the Sprout discussions under programs/replays, you will see all of the different the recordings of these live sessions. So you can go back and explore them and experience them and see, and there's lots and lots of conversations around this. So today, I want to kind of take a step. We're going to go back into 2015, excuse me, for a second, because we're sort of pivoting a little bit into our discussion. So my blog is going to start up again on Monday, and you're going to see that this is really connected. So I'm going to start to connect a little bit what comes out on the blog and what comes out on our live commentary, and hopefully these will bounce back and forth between one another. I'm really actually excited about this, because this is a new turn of events and a new way of looking at things. So I'm going to go back, and we're going to kind of I think we're getting to the place where the dates don't really matter as much as the actual conversation pieces do. This is really what's most important right now, and is really understanding what is happening and where we are. What are the conversations that are coming up from our understanding around the intelligence of plants and the fact that plants are sentient? So I think that's really where we're heading. What are the important and salient parts that come from the idea that plants are sentient, they are intelligent beings, and then what happens from there? So this is a publication that came out in 2015. It is an article. It was written by Monica Galliano, is kind of like the main article, the main author connected to it. And this, I'm trying to see what, it came out in the Australian Animal Protection Law Journal. And I think this is a really interesting perspective, because it's a journal specifically around rights. And it was written by Monica Galliano, who comes from an animal background, because for those of you that don't know, Monica Galliano was originally a marine biologist before she became an ecologist and started studying the intelligence of plants. So this publication is really interesting, because it culminates kind of her work as a marine biologist, as well as her work in plant sentience, so in plant cognition in particular. So this is called The Sentience of Plants, Animal Rights and Rights of Nature Intersecting, and it's a question mark. So let me share the screen. I just realized that I hadn't shared yet. Share in my screen. Here it is. By the way, how are you? How was your week? Or whenever you're watching this, how was it? Just curious. So this came out exactly in 8 years ago. So it's a little bit older, but this is still a discussion that I think is, not only is it valid, I think it's actually still hasn't really been happening yet. Like we're not getting there. So, okay. So there are some notes from the editor that I think are important for us to sort of start with. So here we go. The meaning of sentience. This is the editor speaking. The meaning of sentience may seem clear enough. The meaning of sentience may seem clear enough to some. Derived from the Latin sentire, its primary meaning is to feel, a concept of sentience as the capacity to experience pain and suffering as well as happiness, is the deciding feature in Peter Singer's utilitarian ethical system. Whatever the full scope of meaning may be, there is increasing doubt as to the wisdom of using a concept that is dependent upon a constantly changing combination of scientific and cultural assumptions as a tool for differentiating between species of living being. A legal theorist and evolutionary ecologist, Alessandro Pellizzon and Monica Galliano, are joint authors of The Sentience of Plants, Animal Rights and Rights of Nature Intersecting, this edition's leading article. Okay, so then this just talks about, you know, what exactly the Australian Animal Protection Law Journal is, and its aim is to alert all its readers to relevant international development and ideas. They do talk about a really interesting other article that's called Legal Personhood for Animals. So this is kind of what they're referencing and the idea of what does that mean. And when you see this, there's links to everything. Let's see. Okay. I'm moving down. All right, so those were kind of the important things. So this is the leading article of this. We're not going to go through what all the different articles that exist in this one. We're just going to talk about the sentience plants, animal rights, and rights of nature intersecting. So let's just get into it. The emerging legal theory known as Earth jurisprudence has grown exponentially in the last decade. One of the most notable proposals of this novel legal theory is the attribution of subjective legal status to nature, a proposal that has already been legislated in a number of jurisdictions, as discussed below. The recognition of nature as a subject of and with rights raises a number of questions, most notably considering the issue of agency of and on behalf of nature. And this is really a very salient point that we cannot kind of diminish, which is even when there is a desire to recognize the sentience of plants and the legal right plants have, the question of agency is one, but let's assume for a second we have agency. We believe that the plant is sentient. We believe the plant has the right to have rights, let's say it that way. But then what happens is, who advocates on behalf of that? Is there an advocate that is truly able to connect into the true will of the plant? Or is it always still a filtered human lens will of which we apply over what the plant needs are based on human definitions and human needs? Similar questions have already been explored by the animal rights discourse in its attempt to confer subjective legal status to animals. The importance of the intersection between Earth jurisprudence and animal rights is thus readily apparent. Emergent scientific research has revealed that plants show all the traditional indicators of sentience. This casts doubt upon the utility of the traditional rigid division made between plants and animals. It also suggests that sentience is contingent and fluid concept, one that depends upon the constantly changing combination of scientific and cultural assumptions. These developments suggest that the fundamental proposal of Earth jurisprudence, that all things have rights by virtue of their very existence, may not need to be based on such as sentience, but may be used as the premise for a radical challenge that many anthropocentric legal principles. In doing so, Earth jurisprudence can learn from the legal tradition that has developed around the concept of animal rights, while at the same time stretching all previously established boundaries that traditionally extended rights exclusively to non-human animals alone. So this is an interesting conversation piece here, right? Because we're really getting into the idea that Earth jurisprudence, right, is this whole concept has been thought of specifically around the animal discussion. But now what happens when we introduce plants into this? And I actually read an interesting quote today that came out in the Nature Journal. And the Nature briefings stated, when we're talking about the species of our planet, we can no longer think of flora and fauna. We need to think of flora, fauna, and fungi. So this was a mycologist who was talking about the need to introduce fungi into the conversation. And pretty soon we're going to be having this around bacteria and everything else. So But it's interesting that we've started this on the backwards end, where rather than starting with what has 85% of the biomass of the planet, which is plants, we're starting this whole conversation from the other end, which is like, the whatever 1% of animals that are in. But that's another piece. Anyway, introduction, when and law science. Yeah, when law science meets. When law and science meet, excuse me. In 2012, one of the authors of this paper, founder and then board member of the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, the Australian Wild Law Alliance, and the Earth and Laws Network at Southern Cross University, convened a colloquium entitled Animal Rights and the Rights of Nature, Intersections and Tensions, to explore the intersection between the rights of nature and animal rights discourses. Although many might consider animal protection laws advocates Many might consider animal protection law advocates and rights of nature proponents natural allies. This very quickly appeared not to be the case during the colloquium. The classical divide between ecosystemic approaches faced against the specific concerns of individual animals was rehashed. I'm looking at the footnotes. With dividing arguments as to the actual interaction between the two legal perspectives. At the same time, the other author of this paper was exploring communicative and cognitive abilities of plants. By adopting a quantitative approach commonly used to test these abilities in animals, the exploration delivered innovative, rigorous, experimental evidence showing that plants can not only acquire learned behaviors, i.e., behavior that is not innate, but one an individual develops by being taught or by observing others in a matter of seconds, but they also remember what has been learned for several weeks. The new finding, by the way, that paper was the paper on Mimosa pertica. This is around the time right after the Mimosa pertica paper comes out for Monica Galeano. The new finding called for a revision of the way plants are perceived and conceived, and of the traditionally held boundaries between plants and animals. When the two authors met only a couple of years later, it appeared that the two paths of independent exploration had converged, making it possible for many of the separate threads of the multiple discourses, law and science, rights of nature, and animal rights alike, to begin to be woven together. And thus, a dialogue began between the legal theorist and an evolutionary ecologist to unravel epistemological complexities at the intersection of law and science. Interesting. This dialogue, using the novel legal philosophy of earth jurisprudence, had particular focus on the concept of the sentience in order to show, by reference to the most recent research on plant sentience, that concept, I like the red there for like, do not get this wrong. There are two dots there on purpose. That concept is a cultural construct replete with contextual meaning. The rights of nature rising. All right, are we following along so far? Okay. Hold on one second. Sorry. Okay. When Christopher Stone asked his provocative question at the end of an introductory class in property law at the University of Southern California in 1972, should trees have standing? He could not have predicted how his suggestion would have affected the dominant legal paradigm in decades to come. In the author's words, this suggestion has since assumed a modest but apparently enduring place in contemporary environmental law and ethics, quite out of proportion to its actual impact on the courts. A modest but apparently enduring place in contemporary environmental law and ethics, quite out of proportion to its actual impact on the courts. Which means that really it hasn't made an impact in the courts at all. Anyway, since Stone's own reflection in 2010, the article's impact on courts and legislators alike has been arguably more noteworthy than that. The most significant outcome of Stone's provocative suggestion, so the question is, do trees have standings? So when we're talking about environmental law, the most significant outcome of Stone's provocative suggestion has certainly been the proliferation of rights of nature legislation. Operating since 1995, the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund is a US-based not-for-profit organization that in 2006 managed to draft on behalf of the local community of Blaine Township in Pennsylvania a series of local laws or ordinances which declared that ecosystems have rights within Blaine Township. In the intervening, oh wait, now I want to read this footnote 9, because the other ones are usually stories from the environmental frontier. So it's a paper. These are all papers. Dang it. And I'm gonna have to go reread that because I have read it in the past, right? When the county of Blaine Township in Pennsylvania has laws which declared ecosystems had rights within the township. So ecosystems can be considered persons to a certain extent. In the intervening decade, the number of similar local ordinances facilitated by SELDF, the SELDF, the CELDF in the US grew to well over 100. The Earth Charter, which actually Dom and Her is a member of the Earth Charter. The Earth Charter is a global civil society initiative born as a United Nations initiative, but then finalized and launched in 2000 by the Earth Charter Commission, an independent international organization. Although not explicitly representing nature as a subject with rights and legal standings, the Charter recognizing the rights of all without discrimination to a natural and social environment supportive of human dignity, bodily health, and spiritual well-being. Wow, I haven't read this. I haven't read the Earth Charter in probably about 10 years, but I'm going to just reread that sentence, and I want you to think about what could be the potential problem in this sentence. The right of all, so it does not explicitly represent nature as a subject with rights and legal standings. So no beings of nature have legal rights and standings according to the Earth Charter. It states the right of all. So the first question is, who is all? If this does not represent the rights of nature, who is this all? All humans? All animals? All what? Without discrimination, to a natural and social environment supportive of human dignity, bodily health, and spiritual well-being. All right, Earth Charter. We might need to review the Earth Charter and kind of have our comments on that. Towards this end, it is imperative that we, the people of the Earth, declare our responsibility to the greater community of life. Even more remarkable, so the peoples of Earth declare our responsibility to the greater community of life. I wonder if peoples there, as in persons, are thinking of just human persons or other persons. Even more remarkably, Chapter 7 of Title 2 of the new Ecuadorian Constitution of 2008, we've heard a lot about this, 2008 Constitution of Ecuador includes plant rights in it, expressly grants constitutional enshrined rights to nature or Pachamama, therefore with a clear reference to a pre-colonial Andean cosmology. Nature, or Pachamama, where life is reproduced and occurs, has the right to integral respect for its existence and for the maintenance and regeneration of its life cycles, structures, functions, and evolutionary processes. Hey, Earth Charter, this one's better. This one's better. 3 years later, the first constitutional vindication of nature's rights occurred in the case of the Vilcabamba River. Vilcabamba, I like that name, Vilcabamba River, whereby the provincial court of Loja in Ecuador found against the municipality of Loja and in favor of the Rio Vilcabamba in accordance with the new constitutional provisions. The results of the World People's Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Nature convened by Bolivian President Evo Morales in Cochabamba, Bolivia in 2010 was the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, an aspirational document that expanded upon both the legal innovations and the post-colonial conceptualizations introduced by the Ecuadorian Constitution. Following suit, Bolivia's Plurinational Legislative Assembly passed late in 2010 the Law of the Rights of Mother Nature, Ley de Derechos de la Madre Tierra. Interesting, in the text of the law, human communities are explicitly described as part of nature. Okay, they are technically, can be, depending on how they're done, in a very nuanced definition of life systems as complex and dynamic communities of plants, microorganisms, and other beings of their environment, in which human communities and the rest of nature interact as a functional unit. Under the influence of climatic, physiographic, and geologic factors, as well as productive practices and cultural diversity of all Bolivians. When the recently negotiated and finalized Wanganui Iwi Deed of Settlement is passed into laws, the Wanganui River in New Zealand will be granted legal personhood, thus representing the first instance within a common law country of such a radical reconceptualization of both the legal person and of what constitutes property. So, okay. It will also represent a strong recognition at law of a non-Western worldview, by way of recognizing the agency vested on the traditional Maori iwi, whose identity is intrinsically intertwined with the river itself. On behalf of the river, finally, the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, a not-for-profit international organization established in 2010, has recently instituted an international rights of nature tribunal to hear cases on a yearly basis and as part of activities running parallel to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change conferences of the parties. Although void of any official legitimacy, the tribunal represents a powerful voice of the global civil society on the issue of nature standing. Okay. I just want to state, I think all of this is wonderful. Okay, these are baby steps that we have to take. We have to take all of these little steps, right? This tribunal that's not really legal, but it still will have a voice and it will give some declaration. All of these other pieces that we're seeing, the Ecuadorian constitution, the law in Bolivia. But there is a piece in here that to me bothers me and that I need to express it, which is, even this tribunal is based on the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference of the Parties. In other words, it is associating the rights of nature. So the Wanganui River is a beautiful example of a personhood being declared on a river because the river is part of a cultural tradition. In other words, polluting the river is not about, although it probably is, but from the way it's been framed, is not just about polluting its waters and that creating problems for humans and all these types of things. It is as if you are hurting a member of our family and you're telling me that I don't have the right to intervene or do anything. So now I have the right to do or something on a family member who is getting sick. So it is not that the river's waters are poisoning humans, and that's the reason why the river needs to be protected. It is just the fact that the river is sick. And that is beautiful. That is what we want to get to, where you want to get to a declaration of the conditions and the health and the well-being of the being, the person, plant person, human person, or whatever, as an entity in and of themselves, not so much because of how that affects humanity. My problem with this Rights of Nature Tribunal is that being inside of a climate change conference or connected to climate change most likely means that we're only going to interfere if it affects climate or if it affects the environment or if, AKA, affects humans. Not whether or not something is dirty or polluted or being treated badly or misused or wasted, all because of the dignity of the life in and of themselves. And I know that these are baby steps. I know that we are talking about one step at a time, and we need to move through these various steps. But I just want it on the record that this is only a first step. We need to go farther. Towards an earth jurisprudence. The examples briefly introduced above would be sufficient to vindicate Stone's provocation. Do trees have standing? That's the original provocation, 1970. But more importantly, these examples are representative of a conceptual shift that has occurred both within the in the course of the past 4 decades. What began as a self-described thought experiment in the halls of the US legal academia in the early 1970s has certainly become a livid reality in a number of jurisdictions and much more than a theoretical possibility for many activists and scholars alike. Stone asked, what would a radically different law-driven consciousness look like? What would a radically different, AKA paradigm shifting, law-driven consciousness look like? How would such a posture in law affect the community's view of itself? And that's an interesting question to ask. The answers to this question, the answer to this question, to his questions, was fully articulated for the first time by eco-theologian and self-described earth scholar Thomas Berry. In direct contrast to the Cartesian dualism, Berry argues that the universe is not comprised of a collection of objects, but rather of a community of subjects. Furthermore, the well-being of each individual subject of the universe community is connected to and dependent from the well-being of the community itself. Then the protection of the well-being of the overall community is paramount and ought to take precedence over the protection of any of its members. So this is what I was saying. The well-being of each individual subject of the universe community is connected to and dependent from the well-being of the community itself, then the protection of the well-being. So we have to protect the individual because the individual deserves to be protected. And then that individual who is protected will, of course, trickle away and will help with the rest of the community. So I find that, anyway, that's the direction we need to go. Excuse me. As a result, Berry called for a jurisprudence that would provide for legal rights of geological and biological as well as human components of the earth community. He called this earth jurisprudence. Berry's invitation to articulate in political and legal terms the systemic approach to life on earth, already advocated by a number of scientists, was taken further by South African lawyer Cormac Cullinan in his seminal work, Wild Law. Cullinan expanded on the concept of the great law that Berry had introduced by stating that Earth is our primary teacher, as well as the primary lawgiver. Cullinan coined the terms great law and great jurisprudence to describe the laws or principles that govern how the universe functions, arguing that human governance systems ought to be articulated in harmony with them. This is really, why do we not hear about this? I mean, I've heard about some stuff in New Zealand, and I had heard about Ecuador and Bolivia, but I hadn't heard about this work of wild law and the idea that principles that govern how the universe functions, arguing that human governance systems ought to be articulated in harmony with them. It is Cullinan's argument that seeded the theoretical terrain from which all the aforementioned examples sprung. And Cullinan has been personally involved in a number of these initiatives. If Stone's initial argument was significant in redefining the legal conceptualization of damages beyond the traditional anthropocentric terms within which they were traditionally defined, Berry and Cullinan's suggestion have made it possible to reconceptualize nature not anymore as an object of legal human rights. I repeat that. Cullinan's suggestions have made it possible to reconceptualize nature not anymore as an object of legal human rights, in particular of property rights, but rather as a subject with and of intrinsic legal rights. I like this. Now we're heading in directions I like. The proposal has been replete with possibilities as exemplified by the many legal initiatives in a number of jurisdictions, but it is also fraught with theoretical difficulties. And here we're getting to the catches. This is the point of discussion that we're really going to get into, because I think we're all in agreement that these things should exist. Now the question becomes how. Anne Schillmuller and Alessandro Pellizzon note that nature and rights are contested concepts with negotiable meanings, cautioning against the risk that the yet largely indeterminate terrain occupied by the theory and practice of earth jurisprudence may already be heavily inscribed by humanist precepts of what rights and natures might consist of. Furthermore, the interpretation of the great law as the law of nature that human legal regimes have to be respectful of has led some scholars to interpret it in light of a highly contested natural law doctrinal legacy, thereby potentially missing, we contend, the revolutionary conceptual nature of the suggestion. Peter Burden, for example, represents the distinction as a novel articulation of the traditional natural law, positive and dichotomy, thus hastily dismissing the notion of the great law as too general and overwhelmingly broad to have relevance in Earth jurisprudence. It is undeniable that a simplistic reference to the laws of nature revives well-established critiques historically advanced against natural law theories. However, we contend that the suggestion is much more nuanced than such a traditional distinction would entail. A complete discussion of the legal theoretical implications of the relevance of the great law as an external referent of any human legal and governance initiative is certainly beyond the scope of this paper. However, what is relevant for this paper is that the connection between law and science within the nascent branch of legal theory, a connection to that, to our knowledge, has not yet been fully examined by scholars in this field. Of natural systems and legal persons, the sentience connection. All right, let's see where we're going here. Although Stone's argument has always been taken as the historical basis for the argument of legal personality for the entire ecosystems, one certainly less explored question raised by his proposition pertains to the inquiry whether single individual trees ought to have standing. It's a good question that I asked myself. In other words, could an investigation of the rights of single individual trees tell us anything about the nature of the relationship between the scientific discourse of the project of Earth jurisprudence? It is such an investigation that opens up an interesting interdisciplinary terrain between an emerging Earth jurisprudence and the rich tradition of the legal discourse surrounding animals. Interestingly, some lukewarm responses to Barry and Cullinan's invitation have come from a number of animal law writers. While the unquestionable importance of rights of nature legislation for animals is readily recognized, the wording of such recognition is often rather telling. Since animals form an integral part of the ecosystem, wild law would seek to invest animals with rights, not because of any inherent quality of the animals, but simply because those animals form part of the ecosystem that should be protected. So what we're saying here is that even the existing laws that are pushing toward animal rights are not recognizing the animal rights because the animal has any specific right to those rights or any specific qualities that should require them to have those rights, but because they form part of an ecosystem that somehow affects humans and therefore should be protected. And that is very telling. That's not good. Traditionally, animal rights arguments have been advanced on the basis of concern for individual animals rather than the more abstract concerns for species as a whole. Building on Albert Schweitzer's reverence for life, Peter Singer's argument represents one of the best-known animal welfare arguments. A utilitarian ethicist, Singer argues that the humans ought to include the interest of animals when evaluating any particular course of action that may affect them. Who's the them in that statement? Is the them the humans or is the them the animals? Ooh, this is interesting. The fundamental interest to be taken into account for Singer is the interest in avoiding pain and suffering and experiencing happiness, since the capacity for suffering and enjoying things is a prerequisite for having interest at all. And here we start with the whole problem. Sentience, defined as the capacity to experience pain and suffering as well as happiness, is thus the deciding feature in Singer's ethical system. And here lies one of the biggest problems around the conversation of legal rights for non-human entities, which is non-human entities might experience, that are sentient, do experience emotions, right? But those emotions are not necessarily pain and suffering and happiness, because pain, suffering, happiness, like that range of emotions, is a very human emotion. And is that the right emotional context that we should use for the understanding of animals? And this is, the understanding of plants. And this is the reason why these debates, this conversation, the whole idea of the legal rights of nature are going to take decades for us to iron out. They're going to take all this time because we first have to come to a at least acceptance of the idea that plants or any other kind of being that is non-human, like a mushroom or whatever, has feelings, but that those feelings do not correspond to the labels of feelings that we have given humanity, because our laws are based on these labels that we have given humanity. But if the labels are not the same, for example, if I think about an assault, right? I think about an assault on a human. Legally, you know, it's a crime. It's something that's not to be done. But that's because there is an imminent harm. There's harm that happens to that human being, of which can be different severity. When we're talking about a plant, right, and we're talking about cutting off a leaf, which is a physical body part, is that the equivalent of an attack and an assault, or is it the equivalent of getting your hair cut? These are the legal requirements that we're going to look at, because these are the understandings that we have. If instead we have to first create a whole new definition for the world of plants that includes what is, for lack of a better term, forgive me, good versus bad, what is useful versus not useful, like all these other kinds of aspects of it, then we first have to do that before we could ever get to the legality of whether or not we should be able to do these types of things. So take the river, right, in New Zealand, it was polluted. We used a human definition of polluted, but we also used a definition connected to the fact that the river then, you know, wasn't able to carry out its biological processes, most likely, that the river then had, you know, algae blooms, or that had some kind of thing that gave the impression that the river was sick, independent of whether or not people were getting sick. And therefore, you could say that river has the right, because that river is a part of this tribal culture, is a member of the tribe, that river has the rights to be healthy and safe in and of itself. But when we're talking about a plant, and in particular, when we're talking about a plant in a man-made environment like a city, and you convey rights, what does that mean? Is it that the plant should be able to live their natural life? Well, we know that that's not going to happen based on the way that we currently plant those kind of plants, right? The environment in and of itself. So does that mean that if we're going to have the requirements be that the plant is able to live out its natural life, then we can't even plant the plant? I wish English had a different word for the planting process. But in other words, we can't plant the plant unless the conditions for a good and a healthy life are actually in existence. Like, so do you understand that for us to give legal rights to plants, we need to start conceptualizing wholly different things than humans? So we can probably create some level of definition first and foremost now, based on things like, is the plant able to carry out a good and healthy life? But anything else, pain, happiness, you know, freedom, all these are human definitions that have human understandings, anthropomorphic kind of constraints on them. And we're going to need to redefine all of those before we could ever get to the point of rights. The concept of sentience thus, so let's go back to where we were, thus becomes a creative basis for questioning the boundaries and intersections between the rights of nature and animal rights discourses, and more generally for interrogating connections between scientific knowledge and the project of earth jurisprudence. Traditionally, sentience has not been attributed to plants, so that only animals have been philosophically recognized as deserving of ethical considerations. The rejection of plant life from the realm of sentience, however, clearly demonstrates how nature is discursively constructed within and by the dominant scientific discourse. Exactly. So the fact that up until now we have not included plants in this discussion is this super interesting conundrum, because how do we give the rights to nature when 85% of the biomass of our planet, 82, 85%, it used to be 85, it used to be in the 90s, believe it or not, just in the last 5 years, we've moved from 85% to 82%, but that's another disturbing fact. Anyway, if 82% of the biomass of our planet is plants, then when I think about the rights of nature, by force, I am talking about the rights of plants. But yet the rights of plants have not been conceptualized in the discussion of the rights of nature. Impasse. You see the oxymoron in there? Plant sentience and introduction. A quick overview of the scientific literature on the concept of sentience shows that plants have rarely, if ever, been included in the scientific discourse on sentience. Sorry, I'm reading the footnote. Footnote. Based on the Web of Science search across all listed databases for all records dated between 1900 and 2015 on the topic of sentience, a complete output of 1,026 records was then refined by searching within results for the word plant. Of 1,026, we have 34 records, and robot has 22 records. Oh, I'm going to get into the robot conversation in a few soon, I promise. A closer examination of results for the word plant revealed that only 18 records refer to the sentience of plants rather than sentience as an increased state of human awareness caused by plants, such as entheogenic species. And of those, no paper approached the topic from the scientific perspective. Okay. So sad. Hopefully changing. The conversation on plant sentience, however, has recently been gaining momentum. Interestingly, the growing scientific interest in plant sentience appears paralleled by an even faster growing interest in the question of artificial sentience in robots and machines. Theoretical experimental investigations on the sentience of artificial intelligences, accompanied by formal considerations of robots as moral agents with their own rights, have increased rapidly in recent years. Sentience, if appears, is bursting out of the confines within which it was previously constructed, while also entering the legal discourse. In 2008, the Swiss government's Federal Ethics Committee on Non-Human Biotechnology published a report titled "The Dignity of Living Beings with Regards to Plants." The document followed the Federal Act on Non-Human Gene Technology, which stated in Article 8 that in animals and plants, for including both, modification of the genetic material by gene technology must not violate the dignity of living beings. The 2008 report expressly issued a series of guidelines and recommendations for the ethical treatment of plants. As far as the authors are aware, this is the first legislative initiative to mandate moral consideration of plants for their own sake. The theoretical background that led to the ECNH recommendation was fed by recent findings in the biological sciences, providing increasing evidence that plants are sensitive organisms, not mere objects. Go Swiss, go Swiss. Michael Marder suggests that the de-objectification of plants is a necessary step toward the articulation of the inherent worth and dignity of its entire taxonomic kingdom of non-human living others. Marder argues that the idea that plants should have rights derives from the philosophical recommendation of plant subjectivity. However, Marder continues, and the acknowledgement of plants as not mere objects is not a common feature of the modern, and we may add even of postmodern, mind. For example, Anthony Chihuahuas, one of the pioneers of plant neurobiology in plant behavior and intelligence, explains how scientists have long underestimated plants, particularly with respect to matters of intelligence, sentience, and agency. Notwithstanding, Chihuahuas writes in the foreword of his seminal text that flowers must rank as some of the most beautiful objects, emphasis added, on this planet. This happens. I mean, I sometimes refer to a plant as it, but I do correct when I realize I've done it. So we're not perfect. Although using highly effective prose enriched by quotations from Shakespeare, Robert Burns, and Dylan Thomas, among others, to emphasize the range of aesthetic meaning that plants have historically had for humanity, emblematically, Chihuahua still fails to escape the cultural construction of plants as certainly beautiful objects of scientific exploration. That was a good one. However, recent research has been able to show that plants exhibit sophisticated abilities to actively perceive, assess, learn, remember, solve problems, make decisions, and communicate with each other by acquiring information from their environment, all indicators of human and non-human sentience. Two recent studies published in 2014 are of particular relevance in addressing even more directly the issue of plant sentience. The first study demonstrated perceptual awareness and memory in plants by measuring the defensive leaf folding behavior of the sensitive plant, Mimosa pertica, in response to the repeatedly physical disturbance, Galeano herself's experiment. The second study showed that Arabidopsis plants respond to the sound that caterpillars make when eating other plants and use these feeding vibrations, which are transmitted from tissue far removed from the direct site of attack, to increase their chemical defenses. We've reviewed that paper too. Both cases, the rapid closure of mimosa's delicate leaves and the increase of chemical artillery of Arabidopsis represent clear examples of calculated response to the impending threat of a predator's harm. In the case of mimosa, for example, the experimental data clearly showed that the individual plant does not simply react in a somewhat instinctive and predetermined manner to the immediate stimuli available from the surrounding environment. Instead, that a plant assesses a present situation and preferentially engages in a behavior that appears to be successful from its individual perspective, thus exhibiting a behavioral tendency to approach or avoid similar situations. Examined together, these findings reveal advanced cognitive competencies, which are generally attributed exclusively to humans and increasingly to some non-human animals. Okay, so let's get into this conclusion. Remember, this is a legal paper. This is talking about the pitfalls and the benefits and the desires and the needs in order for us to include plants in the legal literature going forward and the legal rights of nature, that we must see plants as cognitive beings inside of a natural landscape, and that we should convene rights to them. This does not address all of the major issues that we have around the idea of the rights of nature, but it does point some of them out. It doesn't even speak specifically to the idea of who represents the right of those natures, because it is a human that must advocate on behalf of the non-speaking being that is the plant. And how do we ensure that that person is not looking at the plant just for what happens to the plant in basis of society or how it affects humans, but instead on understanding the nature of the plant and what is it the plant needs. And then there's the entire discussion of, is it the individual plant? Is it the species? Or is it the ecosystem in which one specific being finds themselves? So there's lots of questions that still have to come up. But any of these questions, none of these questions can really arise until the law legally recognizes the idea that plants are sentient, and that our next step is to understand what that sentient means in terms of laws. We still haven't even gotten there. We need the legal, that's why the rights of nature are an important first step. The rights of animal beings, but the rights of nature and the rights of animal beings contextualized to understand what are the characteristics that they consider to be important, because then we can apply those characteristics appropriately so and not anthropomorphically to plants, excuse me. But let's see what their conclusion is. That was my conclusion. Let's see what their conclusion is. What does this emerging discourse that recognizes plants as sentient beings mean for Earth jurisprudence and for the intersection between the rights of nature and animal rights discourses? Firstly, sentience clearly appears as a cultural construct with a negotiated scientific meaning that exists in a constantly shifting scientific paradigm. In the scientific world, if the scientific world is now ready to attribute sentience to plants, then the question arises whether the posited and inherently social and artificial boundaries of sentience are just as arbitrary as Descartes' famous dichotomy between the mind, of which for Descartes only humans were possessed, and matter, the rest of the universe, including all non-human living others. More importantly, the attempt to establish moral universal principles based on historical and thus inherently particular cultural constructs is problematic. Sentience, therefore, may not be the most effective basis for an argument that extends rights to non-human entities. Secondly, far from being a modern reenactment of universal laws of nature, the project of Earth jurisprudence is a modern invitation to question any absolute foundation of knowledge. Descriptive statements about nature, traditionally the realm of science, and prescriptive assertions about human behavior, traditionally the terrain of law, are recognized as inextricably intertwined with codependent. In this sense, nature is neither seen as eternally external referent to the system of human cognition, nor is it seen as an immutable reality that human knowledge only ever approximates. Hold on, I'm rereading this a second because it's like confusing. Hey, Laura. Hi. Thank you for your comment. Oh, and thank you so much for your comment. That helps me kind of shift my perspective for a second as I reread this line and try to understand it. Descriptive statements about nature and prescriptive assertions around human behavior are recognized as inextricably intertwined and codependent. In this sense, nature is neither seen as eternally external referent to the system of human cognition, nor is it seen as an immutable reality that human knowledge only ever approximates. Okay, now I understand. Instead, while all meaning is inherently contingent, it is also inscribed within a universe that forms the ultimate term of reference of human knowledge and sustains human governance systems. Okay, so basically they're just saying this is kind of more talking about the idea of the human, that all of this is culturally bound, right? That we need to understand the reference systems in which, and yet at the same time, even though there are reference systems within the culturally bound norms, there is still a universal form that contains everything that we're talking about. A cautionary principle that originates from the recognition of an intrinsic interest to exist of all things, living and non-living, may be a more appropriate starting point to establish legal governance structures that are in line with the operating principles that science construes in its observation of the universe. I like this idea, right? The idea that if we're going to start with the law, rather than thinking about behavior and constructs and health and well-being and pain and suffering, forget any of that for a second. And let's start with the basic idea that the first fundamental laws that we need to put in place are the interest to exist. In other words, all living beings have an intrinsic interest or right to exist, and to exist in an environment that is healthy to them, and exist in an environment in which they are able to grow and thrive. This does open questions when it comes to plants of a whole other nature, but I'm not going to go there right now. Give me a second. Furthermore, rather than operating in a fixed paradigm where knowledge of the universe is a somewhat stable quantity, the invitation to an earth jurisprudence is also an invitation to a dynamic reality whereby the non-human other is constantly reimagined. Therefore, the attribution of legal agency to non-human other operates more effectively as a theoretical premise, rather than being based on a contextual and contingent concepts such as sentience. So there's the idea of that if we're going to think about this kind of as I was saying before, right, where we look at just your right to exist, the attribution of legal agency, the ability for me to have rights and to be protected, is more of a premise that's based on just the idea of that I exist. So like, I suffer a lot with trying to figure out things that don't have sentience, because I sometimes want to use a rock, for example. There are people who would tell me that the rocks have sentience. So I don't know, a book, does a book have sentience? Let's go with a book for right now, right? The question is whether or not do we apply all the way down to legal agency that says that if a book was a natural object, something created in nature, and it was inert, whatever the heck that means, does it have, though, an intrinsic right to exist? And therefore, we should start from the base premise there. Or should we start from the base premise around sentience of some sort and convey your right to exist based on sentience? Bit of a conundrum. Finally, the inherent contingency of meaning described above may overwhelm any prospective scholar of earth jurisprudence with an intellectual paralysis in front of the enormous and possibly amorphous possibilities it entails. I think we could all agree with that. Totally can agree with that. Hello, Jill, and thank you. I know it is. This is a really fascinating. I'm super happy that I found this in my notes and have able to go through this here, because I do think that it opens us up to, even though it is a legal paper and we're talking about rights, but it kind of pushes us to rethink certain things and to start to understand our plant friends in many different ways. Like, how do we best advocate for our plant friends? How do we best represent them? And what does that really mean? So last sentence, it is this sense that a more established animal rights tradition can provide support and existence by indicating a path well trodden to engage in a continuing normative dialogue with the great other with which we share this existence. It's a pretty good. So the whole premise of this paper, just for those of you that might have kind of joined us halfway, and the reason why that ending is very appropriate is because what is being said is that rather than restarting all the way from the beginning, let's pick up from plant sentience. Let's connect plant sentience to animal rights discussions, and then see where is it that they intersect. So the rights of animals as well as the rights of nature, like nature as a whole, which I still think that that's such a weird term, the rights of nature. Like, what does that even mean? So what does that mean? What do animal rights mean? And then when you look at these two, how do I apply them to nature? So, I mean, how do I apply them to plants? That's why this discussion piece was so interesting, and the final phrase was so interesting. I actually found this kind of paper, I don't even know what these are called, essay, I guess, or really interesting, because I think it's starting to show us what are some of the major discussions that we're going to start to get into as there's more and more understanding as to the fact that plants are sentient and alive. So I still think that in order to have this conversation done right, we need to start to create an understanding, or at least explore the fact that we don't understand what plants' emotions look like, and what is plant health. I mean, we know what plant health looks like from a biological perspective, but what does quality of life mean for a plant? And I think we're going to have to start to explore some of these topics. And this is great because I think this is an important topic for all of us to understand, because for me to better understand my own human quality of life, since I have part plantness in me, I need to understand plant quality of life and vice versa. So I really see this as a very interesting intersection between the two. All right, so on that front, that's it for today. I hope you really enjoyed this. I'm looking forward to your comments and to your thoughts on this. These are more of the types of conversations that we're going to be having going forward. So until then, what can I say? Resist the urge to hold back your evolving green brilliance. I really want to hear your thoughts. I want you to let yourself loose. You are in a safe environment. And until we meet next time, I look forward to seeing your comments in the Naturally Conscious community. Bye-bye, Sprouts. Bye-bye.